Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Ted Abernathy, and I'm the Managing Partner of Economic Leadership. And what we're going to try to deal with today is preparing for the next new normal. And I'll go ahead and start by saying I don't know if we'll ever be normal again. I think we'll be a continuous change. But we're going to try to talk through today a few of those things. Someone is going to be advancing slides for me today, so I'm going to be saying next like I am now. To move from slide to slide. So I thank them for some of the technical stuff. We're going to try to deal with just a few things today. First, we're going to set the economy as we come into 2020 and talk about the current impact. Then we're going to try to understand what we should be expecting as we move from the response phase into the recovery phase. Then we'll talk a little bit about the new normal and what's different going out of this crisis than when we came in. We'll talk a little bit about what we can expect from additional government help, and then finish up with what you can do to prepare your communities. So next, please, to the next slide. And as you can see on the chart, we started 2020 by finishing the longest expansion of jobs in the history of the United States. 113 straight months of job growth, and then you can see at the very end the beginning of this crisis, which is the March numbers where we began to lose jobs in a large number. Next, please. Our annual employment growth over the last 10 years has been fairly consistent. In fact, it's been averaging 1.5% a year. The last few years a little slower, mostly because we were about out of labor. Most of the people who wanted work had found it by then.
Hi, Ted. I'm sorry to interrupt. This is Will. We're getting some comments in the Q&A from participants, but there's some background noise. I'm not sure if it's on your end or someone else's, but just a reminder, I think everyone is muted, and if you're not, if you could be.
Okay, I don't think it's on my end. I'm not hearing anything, but
okay. Sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. And obviously, I can't hear on the other end, and so that's great. Please do again if needed. If you'll move to the next slide, which is the map of the United States. Even though we had been growing jobs over the last few years, when we came to the end of February this year, job growth had actually shrunk in about a third of the metros in America. So as you can see up in the manufacturing part of the Midwest, some of the energy areas, even in eastern North Carolina, we had metros that were shrinking, had lost some jobs during that period of time. So it wasn't all great news as we moved in. Some of that had to do with just cycles, like energy cycles. Some of it had to do with some trade issues that we were having at the time. But overall, it was a little bit of a mixed bag. If you'll move to the next slide, the 5-year job gains by North Carolina, though, paints a picture of a state that had been doing really well. We had been growing in almost every sector faster than the U.S. economy. We've had strong population growth. And over that 5 years, you can see our construction growth significantly outpaced the country's in financial services and information, professional and technical services. It had been a long expansion that really had been very good to our state. Next slide, please, shows that over that 5 years, most of the counties in North Carolina were growing. The ones that are in dark green were growing above the state average, but we still had a little under 20% of our counties that were losing jobs over that last 5 years. Next slide, please. GDP measures the growth of the economy of states, and as you can see, over the last year, a lot of the fastest growing states in the country were west. North Carolina was solidly in the middle, upper middle part of that at 2.3% overall GDP growth. Next slide, please. And that GDP growth had been pretty standard at about 2.25%. Last year was a very average year for the U.S., 2019. So next slide. As we came into 2020, we had a slowing but still very long expansion with a strong economy, full employment with near record low unemployment, high consumer confidence, good household savings rates that had risen after the Great Recession, mostly healthy housing and commercial real estate markets, low interest rates, And I'll admit up front, so some of you were thinking, not every place and certainly not every person was doing as well, but on average, a pretty good economy coming into this year. Next slide. Then we hit 2020, and I want to talk a little bit about the trends and what has stayed the same and what has changed as we've moved into COVID-19. Next slide. The COVID-19 virus is not one of those things that people planned on, maybe to our fault. We have not prepared well for a global pandemic. It isn't something that people never thought about, but in places like North Carolina and others, our resiliency was built around hurricanes or downturns in the economy or some sort of financial crisis. But this pandemic hit very hard. Next slide, please. I'm not going to pretend to be a health professional today because nobody actually knows what we can expect going forward. I'd say listen to the experts. We don't know yet exactly how the virus started or how many people are actually infected because we don't have that level of testing. We don't know how many people are asymptomatic, how many have either currently have the virus or don't, who have had it and don't have any symptoms. We don't know what the impact of hot weather in the summer is going to be. We don't even know yet if immunity occurs after you had the virus, and we don't know what the mutations will be or when we'll get a good vaccine. So everything we talk about today is tainted with uncertainty because we're not sure where we go in the future based on the medical side. Next slide, please. But a few things are going to remain the same as we come out of this. When we move from response to recovery to rebuilding, some of the things that we went into the virus situation with don't change. Next slide. The first is that we're in a world of acceleration right now. Everything seems to be getting faster. Our customer expectations are for instantaneous these days. Our technology adoption rates are shorter than they've ever been, speed to market, and no one expects this to change as we come out of this crisis. Next slide. The second is that we've been disrupting our economy for a considerable period of time. New technologies like Spotify or new approaches like Airbnb or even Amazon or Grubhub have already been disrupting what we have. And we've talked about this a lot over the last 3 or 4 years, that as a state and as local economies, we're facing disruption every day. Next slide. The jobs are continuously changing. My college roommate was owned a travel agency, was very successful, but travel agencies are a lot fewer these days. Data entry clerks are not what they used to be. Reporters, disc jockeys, or even medical devices. So we're seeing that continuous change. There's no reason to believe when we come out of this that those types of changes will be any different. Next slide. In fact, we've talked a lot in the last 2 or 3 years about what's going to happen with automation, what was going to happen to people who were most susceptible, whether they were office or administrative support people or food prep or transportation. And I would tell you, and I will in a few minutes, that it's going to be even faster and more of a threat than it has been going into this. Next slide. The third trend that isn't going to change is that there were places that were doing really well and there are places that were doing not as well, and that won't change. Next slide. You can look at lots of slides that show this, but this is just one on the tech sector in North Carolina and the country. North Carolina, over the last 5 years, has grown faster in technology by a factor of more than double than the national average. But at a time when technology is permeating every industry, we have states like Kentucky and Kansas and Delaware and Arkansas that are actually losing tech jobs. And so there are winners and losers, both in terms of places and in terms of people, but the place-based winners and losers, when we come out of the recession, out of the pandemic, will be very similar to they were going in. Next slide. This complicated chart is one we do every year that looks at how states have done economically in terms of job growth and wage growth and GDP, and how they're ranked individually by companies that say best place to have a business, start a business, do that. you're down in the green box at the lower left, you see places like North Carolina and Florida and Texas and Utah that are some of the strongest states, both in terms of their reputations and in terms of their output. You look up in the top right corner where around the red, you see places like Vermont and Rhode Island and Illinois and Mississippi that are not rated well and have not performed well. What we know coming out of this is that those competitive factors, the things, the labor force, the infrastructure, the business climate, will be very similar to the way we went into this. So North Carolina should come out of this recession with a lot of opportunity, and I keep saying recession, I apologize, this pandemic with a lot of opportunity that it had going in. So there's no reason to believe that our competitive position will have changed. Next slide. Fourth trend that is likely to even get more acute during this is the decline in the American business dynamism. If you go to the next slide, you can see that over the last 30 years, business growth has been slowing, new business formation. At the same time, the overall death rate of businesses has stayed relatively the same, meaning that we don't have as many new small businesses as we've had before. Next slide. And part of that is simply a change in corporate structures. More corporations are merging over time, and over the last 20 years, the concentrations of big businesses controlling sectors has risen pretty dramatically. We can see that in our daily lives and who we deal with and how we do that. This pandemic is going to impact small business pretty heavily, and the expectation is that bigger businesses that can sustain this time will do even better, and you'll see more concentration. The next, number 5, the next slide is the talent wars. And I don't think any topic was talked about as much in the last few years as the quest for talent. How many people could find, a good job was a very high number, but businesses overall couldn't find the people they were looking for. If you go to the next slide, you can see one of the reasons why is that our labor force in the United States had slowed pretty dramatically. We don't have the same level of people entering the labor force as we've had over time, and that creates less people at a time when the economy was expanding, and so we end up in the country with fewer than what we need. Now, as we talk about more automation, then this might sort itself out, but as we come out of this pandemic, what we're going to end up with is a skills gap that is very similar to the one that we had 6 months ago. Next slide, please, takes you to a national map of population. This is population growth projections for 10 years for ages 25 to 44. And as you can see, North Carolina is one of those states that expects to grow pretty significantly. Our population growth has been strong for a long time now, and we expect it to continue to be strong. So as we move into 2021, 2022, the workforce issues are probably not going to be as much about the quantity of workers, but about the quality of the skills that they have. The next slide, please, shows the North Carolina population growth over the last decade. And the slide shows some of our rural counties have not been growing as much as our urban counties. Not a surprise to anybody on the call, but if you put every state's maps up next to this, you'd find that this is a national phenomenon. So one of the questions that a lot of people are asking today is what happens in the next few years as the urban-rural divide plays out. Are people more likely to move to a less dense area? And we'll talk about that in a minute. The next slide, please. So those are the things, those trends, along with many others, have not changed as we entered this era. But some things actually that were trends we've talked about for a very long time are likely to change. So we look at the next new normal, go to the next page, please. And one of the things that has been a constant since the late 80s in the US is globalization and the idea that we're going to have global supply chains. As the magazine cover on the right shows, The Economist last year pointed out that we were actually starting to see a reversal of globalization already. Next slide, please. Back in February, I had this chart up for a thing I did for the North Carolina Community College system. And what it showed is that the volume of global trade had been shrinking over the last 10 years. So we were already at a decelerating global trade, still growing, but it was growing at a slower rate. And the reason for that was labor costs had equalized around the world, transportation costs had got higher. And so we went into the last few months with a slowing down global economy. And I think most people assume that one of the absolute givens of what happens in the next few months and few years is that we start reshoring our supply chains. We'll talk about that in a minute. The next slide, please, is the other major issue that we've talked about a lot, which is urbanization. It's very true that over the last 50 years, more and more people have lived in fewer and fewer dense places. And those dense places have been epicenters for some of the worst of the COVID-19 impacts. Next slide, please. So I think one of the real policy questions will be, will people begin to change and move from more dense housing to less dense housing? And what will that mean over time? Will more of our collar communities get around urban areas have increased growth? Will some rural areas or some areas that are ex-urban actually become a more attractive place so that people are distanced the way that they need to be about the impacts? Next slide, please. These were all thoughts from February, and in the near future, I think they're all going to be impacted. The first is that technology was starting to decouple. China was trying to be the standard, and in the last few months, quietly during this crisis, China has announced a new plan to set standards for technology themselves. You're going to see a real race for technological standards between the East and the West. In the last 2 months, you've seen more moves from authoritarian governments around the world to tighten their rein, everything from China and Hong Kong to the Middle East, and you're going to see a change in the global dynamics. I said in February that we were globally vulnerable to pandemics and also weather, and I think we are. And then I also talked about a debt throttle, that nationally our debt had gotten high enough that it was going to be hard to invest in the future. And I was dead wrong about that, because as you'll see in a few minutes, the federal government has been investing heavily. Next slide, please. So we go into from 2020 to 2021. To go to the next slide, what can we expect? So we don't know yet what's going to happen when we start reopening around the country. We don't know the timing, but the current estimates are pretty clear. We're going to have significant losses in jobs, GDP, businesses overall, individual and corporate savings, consumption, and consumer confidence is going to go down pretty significantly. Each community will be impacted differently. If you're a heavy manufacturing community and you manufacture things that are still needed, you will probably rebound quickly. If you're a tourism community, things might not rebound as quickly. And if you'll press the next next two buttons, you'll see on the right side of this same slide, one of the things that communities need to do right now is get a better understanding of what drives their local economy. Are they driven by manufacturing or technology companies, by tourism, by agriculture, by the military? Are they a bedroom community driven by services? Because the impacts on each of you is going to be different based on what the traded clusters are within your community. And traded clusters are the types of companies that bring money from outside a community back into it. And they can be a lot of different things. A traded cluster, in Ocean Isle is very different than a traded cluster in Hickory. But each of them needs looking at right now to determine what's going to be next. Next slide, please, shows the annual GDP growth. And this is the growth that we've seen for the slide before. We looked at right now an estimate of 2020 of 6% contraction in our overall GDP. If you'll press one more button, nationally, our unemployment rate is expected to rise to about 14% in the second quarter, and the current estimates are that it could remain in double digits well into 2021, which would be much longer than the Great Recession's impacts of 2008 and 9. Next slide, please. So now some of the things that are likely to happen because of the pandemic. The first is corporations and individuals are much more likely to begin to use robots, drones, and 3D printers. Next slide, please, which should have a bunch of pictures on it. Before, in 2019, we were seeing lots of robots in construction and manufacturing, but I'm expecting a big acceleration in the number of robots used in healthcare, in senior living support, and also in consumer goods. What we found is that businesses that were heavily robotic can continue to work through the crisis, and businesses that were very dependent on individual workers, especially those that touch their clients on a regular basis, have really suffered during this. Next slide, please. The other thing that we can expect is more remote and more digital everything. There's going to be more people working remotely. Shopping has exploded nationally, from grocery stores to pharmacies to do-it-yourself online shopping. Banking has moved quickly into more remote and digital. Entertainment has. Individual health care, and the governor has signed some changes that allow more health care remotely. Education, obviously, most of our kids and even our college-age kids are doing education online now. And then finally, fitness. One of the fastest growing areas in the last few months has been at-home fitness. After you see all of that, you're also going to see some shifts in real estate. And they're going to be reimagined. So if you click to the next slide, this is just one company's telehealth slide. Between March 16th and April the 6th, which is 3 weeks, they went from 100,000 televisits a day to 1.5 million. And that, whether or not we ever want to go back to getting up and going to the doctor's office while feeling sick, or whether we can do more of that remotely, is really going to test the American consumer. The next slide shows office space. As you're thinking about your communities, back in the 70s, the average office allotted per employee in an office building was 320 square feet. By last year, it was already down to 150 square feet, so less than half. And by 2025, it's expected now to be even lower. So you'll have, and I know people are saying, well, wait a minute, you're going to have spread out, you're going to be 6 foot apart, but you're also going to have a lot more remote work or temporary office space, and so the overall number is going to go down. The next slide, sadly, is retail. And this crisis should accelerate some of the retail trends that we were already seeing, which is real pressure on department stores to try to make it through this. You're going to see a lot of the retail big boxes that were already in trouble close during this period of time, and that's going to leave a lot of real estate vacant in our communities, especially in big boxes at key locations. Next slide, please. As we keep going, we're also going to see frugal customers. We're going to see people's savings rate rise even more. We had savings rates that were in the 2% range before the Great Recession, and they've settled in at about 7% after the Great Recession. People are expecting now that they will continue to rise. That will take more sales tax out of people's coffers as people keep the money. The next bullet on this is less mobility. People are expected to move less, and we're certainly going to move our goods around the country and around the world less. The next bullet is that the experience economy, which millennials are known for, may take a hit. Hotels, airlines, and tourism may be very slow to recover. Outdoor recreation has sort of filled the bill in between, but It's going to take a lot of work, and I think it's the Senate bill in North Carolina that has money for the travel and tourism industry. It's going to take a lot of work to get people back to spending the type of money and the type of time they did on experiences out in the public. The next bullet was that we should expect some increases in isolation to be more normal for many years to come. People are scared right now, and it's going to be a relearned experience to want to be out in public, in crowded places. Certainly some people will come back right away, but overall, we expect that to take a little while. Next slide is the government response. We have had both a state and federal response that has been aggressive. The next slide, early March, the first amount of money was allocated. It was $8.3 billion from the feds for public health agencies to do vaccine research. Next bullet, please. Then on March 18th, almost 2 weeks later, the Family First Coronavirus Response Act was done. It was $192 billion, which seemed like a huge amount of money at that point to enhance unemployment insurance, help with Medicare and food spending, and to extend some tax credits and to do some more testing. Next slide. Then on March 27th came the CARES Act, one of the biggest acts ever done in America. It was $2 trillion. Some of that to critical companies. This was the first of the payback protection program for small business. This was the unemployment extension. It was also the eligible taxpayers getting their $1,200 checks and the first help to hospitals. Next slide, please. Then on April 24th, it came back, which was the fourth bill, some people referring to as the $3.5 bill, or another $500 billion to add more money into the small business fund. Everybody's aware how fast that went. Some more money for hospitals and additional money for testing. If you look at the next chart at the bottom, the response to date has been $2.7 trillion. Just to give you some idea, federal revenue, all the money collected last year by the federal government was about $3.4 trillion. We spent about $4.4. We had a $1 trillion deficit last year, but that gives you an idea of how significant the response has been. Next slide, please. So then the question is, what's the next thing that we should expect from the federal response? And if you'll press a couple buttons there as we build on that slide, there's a lot of people who think the next bill should have support to state and local governments. Next, some huge infrastructure bill. We've been fighting over an infrastructure bill nationally for 15 years now, and some people think this is the time. Next thing would be a big fight over debt. You're starting to see some pushback that we've overextended at this point. Next, please, would be support to the energy sector, which with the way gas prices, and specifically oil prices, have collapsed, have really put pressure. And then finally, there's going to be a big fight over whether we should be contracting the federal safety net to save money or expanding it to provide more help for people. Next slide, please, is to a map. One of the key issues at the federal level is going to be the fight over pension plans at state. Mr. McConnell has already said that he doesn't want money used to bail out states for past wrongs. The good news for us here in North Carolina is we're one of the best funded pension plans for state workers in the country. As you can see, some of them are funded in the 30% range, including Kentucky, Mr. McConnell's home state. North Carolina is well funded at 90%, so it's unlikely that that's going to be our big issue here. But I would be surprised if the next federal funding didn't include a clause that states couldn't use that money for some of their past debt issues. Next slide, please. In North Carolina, the question is, what are we going to see from our legislature? Obviously, they went into session today. I've been listening to a lot of legislators talk over the last few days. If you'll go to the next slide, some of the priorities that I'm hearing is very high number of people talking about small business assistance at state level, mostly through the Golden Leaf Foundation. Some more stabilizing financing for our hospitals, especially some of our rural hospitals. any way we can to open the tourism economy around the state. We know how critical it is. Helping our education community prepare to reopen. What is that going to mean? Some local government assistance is also being talked about. School nutrition supplements. A lot of people talking about DOT and what might happen with transportation. And then, as you can see on the right, the issue that I think has gotten the most discussion in the last few days that I've been hearing is how critical broadband is going to be as a universal, available, reliable, and affordable utility across the state. I think you're going to see a great deal of information about that. Next slide, please. As we look forward, the question is, where are we headed economically? One more slide. CEOs were polled last week. About 80% of them believe that we're either in a U, which means a slow recovery, or a W, which means a double dip. Very few think that this is going to be quick as we go forward. It's anybody's guess, and how fast we can get testing on the ground and how fast we can get a vaccine will determine that. Next slide, please. And what I want to conclude with is, what can you do? You need to start by reassessing the community drivers that you currently have. Everyone needs a real good understanding of what type of industries drive your overall community and how those industries are impacted by this. Next bullet is close contact with your anchor institutions. Real good discussions now with your business organizations, your large employers, your hospitals. And we're still in the response stage. So all of the people providers, all the people who are providing food and shelter and emergency funding in your community. But to understand how your community is going to come out of this, you've got to figure out how each of these organizations are viewing their short-term future. The next bullet is, it's time to start doing real serious scenario planning for the future, starting in every community with the worst case. If we are in a W situation where we open slowly this summer but have another setback in the fall, what would that mean to your community? Next bullet is an honest assessment of what that means to fiscal impacts in your community. What does it mean to tax revenue? What does it mean to your consumers? You can model that now. Most of you have done economic impact models when a new business was looking in your community for incentives or something else. Well, you can do the same type of modeling backwards. If you lose this many new jobs, if you lose this much retail sales in your community, if you lose this much tax revenue, what does that model and look like? And that's the prudent thing to start doing now. Next click is to do a detailed strategic action agenda for your transition. As you move from response to reopen to recovery, what is it that you're planning to do in your community? What can you do? What can you take advantage of? Next slide starts with chase every bit of state and federal and foundation funding that you can find. Economics in a community is built around the amount of money coming into the community. And so everything that you can get your hands on from the state, federal, or foundation funding, you need to chase now and need to devote the resources to try to help your community get that. The next is to build an opportunity list for your volunteers. I'm sure that people have come to you and said, what can we do? And pretty soon your civic clubs and your church groups are going to say, we want to help. What can we do? Now's the time to start building a list of the things that people can actually help you do, and have that opportunity list waiting for the next time someone asks your mayor or your city council person, well, what can we do to help? Have a list and have them able to help with that. The next bullet says it's time to review your zoning rules and regulations, because you're going to have some changes that are going to impact you. And the final bullet on this page is updating your economic development strategy. If you'll go to the next slide, in your economic development strategy, there are going to be reshoring of manufacturing. We know that critical industries are going to be coming back to the U.S. and where they're going to be looking for places. The biopharma and medical device industry is going to come back in a big way. We're going to have new logistics companies, software, telecom, food processing are all likely to grow out the backside of the pandemic. When you think about an explosion now in IT applications around food and drink or online gambling or entertainment or e-commerce, all of those companies are growing today. They're going to be looking at expansions as we move forward. You need to be looking at your community's available product, whether you have buildings and sites that are ready, because speed is going to be extremely important. When people start trying to make decisions, they're going to look for the places that are ready to go. Your economic developers can already start doing their updated websites and maybe check, see what it's time, whether your incentive policy is where you want it to be coming out of this. Money's going to be tight, but opportunities are going to be there. And then the retraining capacity of your local community college is going to be critical. Many people are going to need new skills, and whether or not those are short-term certificate training programs or AA degrees, the community colleges are going to have to be flexible and aggressive in trying to provide that retraining. On the next slide, the planning, zoning, and permitting side, you're going to be feeling significant pressure for flexible residential use, especially for auxiliary buildings, for, mom's not in the nursing home anymore, she's there. We're going to need childcare. I've got to move my office home. There'll be a lot of pressure for that, a lot of reuse for retail, hotels, childcare, or offices that businesses might not be able to refill. Time to begin to reimagine your entryways, your centers and key locations in case businesses are boarded up. You can expect a lot of property owner association conflicts because people are going to be wanting to use their property to supplement their businesses. And speed and certainty are going to be the highest value for companies looking in. Finally, the last slide here is, and final thoughts, these are critical times for communities to think past the response stage and begin to think forward. I know how hard that is because none of us have enough resources to deal with daily stuff today, and the health and the lives are the most important things. But as we transition from being focused specifically on lives to livelihood, then being prepared is going to be real important, and following these trends and trying to understand how they're going to impact your community is going to be the real difference between communities that come out of this better and those that are going to be facing impacts for several years. So I'll stop there, and I know someone's going to translate questions that you might have, and I look forward to trying to answer them. If you go to the final slide, you can contact me directly if you want to follow up on anything. My email is up here. And again, very much thanks to the League of Municipalities and to Stuart for allowing me to be part of this today.
And thank you, Ted. I'm going to pick up with questions that have come through. There's been a few. The first question to ask you, and I'm going to paraphrase this one, is talking about food security and local agriculture, as well as energy security, and the distance between houses and Main Street. And the question is what are your thoughts for North Carolina? Are North Carolinians going to be better off in somewhere like Morganton as opposed to somewhere like Charlotte?
I think several questions in there. The first is that I think food security and our food supply chain is going to become critical. I expect in the next year that a great deal of public policy discussion at the federal and state level is going to be about critical industries that we're going to talk. We've talked a lot about energy in the past. If you just take that one step further and talk about what we have to produce in America, what the health, medical devices and pharmaceuticals and drugs, I think the number today is about 10% of the drugs that we use in America are actually produced here. I think you're going to see a huge change there. And I think that the food security issue, a lot of the farm to table movement that was part of a discussion in North Carolina in recent years has become a huge discussion. So I think a great deal of opportunity coming out of the pandemic for that. I think that the real question, I think it's a great question, is am I going to want to live in a dense location because of the services that are there moving forward, or am I going to try to move to a less dense? And I think companies are going to have to, companies want to be where they can get employees, and I think companies are going to have that discussion going forward. I think the most immediate winners are going to be suburban. splitting the difference, if you will. But I think that there's a real chance that communities that have been bypassed in the past are going to get a lot of attention from companies that if they have the infrastructure and the building and sites, companies that want to locate some of their new facilities there.
Okay. The next question. A normal APR for savings accounts is somewhere between 4 and 6%. It's been hovering at less than 1% the last 10 years. What's going to inspire people to save more? When will borrowers stop getting virtually free money at the expense of savers?
Yeah, so I agree that it's been virtually nothing, and I know people who think the best thing to do is put it in a jar and stick it on the shelf. So the odds of interest rates going up in the near term are pretty low, but there is some macroeconomic discussions that maybe holding inflation down to the levels that it has been consistently down now for almost 20 years is not a good thing, and that the only way to get us, and we're down in the deep weeds of economics now, but the only way to help us recover from the debt globally that we're all taking on right now would be to allow some inflation to happen to get us out of that, and that inflation would also reflect itself in the returns. I think the problem people are going to have in the short term is that they're going to want to stimulate activity, and that activity is you're going to see very low interest rates for housing, you're going to see low borrowing rates for companies, and I think you're going to see that for a while. But I think in the long run, you may actually see a change in how people approach inflation, and that would be the big change.
Okay, the next question. Do you think the stimulus funds will impact bond ratings?
Yes, but I think that there's going to be a bunch of changes in bond ratings. I think municipal bonds are going to shake out based on how much impact there is on local governments, and I think stimulus funds, whether or not the federal and state money can catch a lot of the local city and county governments around the country and keep them from a real crisis is going to be important. I think corporations went into this fairly heavily leveraged, but in pretty good shape, and depending on the length, could come out with corporate bonds being pretty well. But the short answer, and I invite the person who asked this just to email me, we can have a longer. Short answer is it depends on where the stimulus money goes, and if it goes to places that are that have bonds that it can help reduce their exposure, then yes, it will have an impact. But if it doesn't go there, if it goes to more spending in places where the bonds aren't as impactful, then it won't have as much impact on the bond market.
Okay. This next question might be one that I can pick up, asking about the priorities that the league is pushing during the current legislative session. I'll preface that saying that we have weekly advocacy updates on Thursdays at 3 p.m. for anyone interested. That's happening every week. Our lobbying team and grassroots team are hosting those. If you either reach out to myself, Will Brooks, or you go on our website to find my email, or there is also, I think, a link to it on our calendar for that. So I encourage you to listen in to hear the latest. And as far as our priorities, revenue shortfalls at the local level, encouraging the state legislature as well as the federal government to fill the gaps that local governments are going to have. Unfortunately, there was not funding in the latest stimulus that Congress approved. So it's pretty vital right now because local governments aren't going to be able to do it alone. That's what our government affairs team would definitely underscore. And then also the realization that broadband, which has been a priority of the leagues for many years now, broadband expansion, the local, allowing cities to put more infrastructure in the ground to have broadband in places that it currently isn't. So that's also a big push of ours at the start of the short session. So I'll stop there and move back to you, Ted. Next question is asking for a copy of your slides, if that is possible.
Well, as I always say, this is the League and Stuart show, so if they're happy to share the slides, I'm happy for them to have PDFs of the slides.
Okay. What zoning or regulatory changes do you anticipate will be necessary?
I think this is a really good question. So I do think the very first thing you're going to see a lot of pressure on is two. One is permitting auxiliary buildings on residential, and I think you're going to see a high pressure for that, and with very different uses for them. Some granny flats actually being for granny and some being for business, and I think that's going to cause some real interesting dilemmas for communities. And the second is going to be change of uses in commercial buildings that have been vacated. And some of you have commercial use that's pretty broad in individual uses, but it's really likely that you're going to see uses that were once retail now need to be office or medical or whatever. And your flexibility around parking ratios and bathroom ratios and all that kind of stuff, you need to start anticipating it now. I don't think anybody's going backwards from online purchasing. I think that you're going to see a lot of pickup stuff, more drive-through, more storage, a little bit, instead of just in time, we're going to see places looking for more storage. Some of that'll be outdoors. But I think it's a great time to start just looking at your overall regulations and trying to make sure that you're anticipating what is likely to be a lot of changes, because you're going to back up your planning boards and eventually your city councils, and speed's going to matter to these places. And if you're trying to help these companies stay afloat or help individuals try to deal with the personal crisis that they've been given, then speed on your end is going to be something you can really do to make a difference. So I think try to get out in front of it.
Ted, the next question: should communities be getting projects shovel ready in anticipation of possible transportation dollars coming through in a stimulus?
The answer to that is yes. So I think many of us were around in 2009 when the stimulus happened then, which was a much less, and a lot of projects were funded just because they were ready to go. And I don't mean that to be particularly critical, but there wasn't a lot of thought about what was the most important thing that we needed to do. And I think this time will be very similar. This was about, we're stimulating the economy to get things to turn around fast. And so if you're not ready for fast, then you probably won't end up getting the money. The goal here is to get the money out quickly from the feds, and I presume eventually from North Carolina. And so I would have my list ready to go, and that includes, I would have stimulus money at the federal and state level ready to go. I would have specific requests for foundations and philanthropic purposes ready to go. I would try right now to identify those things that I thought I could implement as quickly as possible that would make a difference in my community. And the same thing is true. I thought you were going to ask the question about shovel-ready buildings and sites for economic development. A friend of mine has a adage that no product, no project. If you do not, when the manufacturers and the distribution people are ready to go, they're going to be looking for something right away. And so you need to make sure that you're ready to go with some product, or you're not going to be one of the places that gets to take advantage of the opportunity.
Okay, and Ted, I think we're at the 4 o'clock hour. We have one more that is we have not touched on this topic. With the rapid decrease in consumer demand, supply has not been able to pull back as quickly. Are we at a risk of global deflation, even though we want inflation?
Yes, in a short term, and I would expect inflation to, in any crisis, you're likely to see it sort of bottom out on consumer demand. But this is a bit odd. I mean, consumer demand is up in a bunch of areas and down in a bunch of areas, down in service areas, up in the consumption areas. So I would say that likely to be uneven. And part of this depends on the global marketplace. And some countries that we do a lot of business with are in better shape than others. I tend to be an optimist, and I hope that people are spending money that whatever they have at the before too long, and I expect that that we won't be normal anytime soon, but we will be consuming over some period of time going forward, and so I'm not as worried about. I was more worried about deflation as we have less people to consume. So I think the trick here is going to be that how fast we change to what that new normal is. But I understand that the questioner's concern, and it certainly is a possibility. We need to see how consumers are going to react. And again, thank you for having me with you today. I really do appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Ted. This has been enlightening. Yeah, go ahead, Cindy.
Great. And just for everyone that's listening, my name is Cindy Schwartzkopf, and I'm Stewart's Director of Business Development for the government sector. And, on behalf of Stewart and the League, I really want to thank you, Ted, for your time today, your insights, sharing your knowledge with all of us on the call. I think what we'll do, if it's okay with you, Ted, is the questions that we weren't able to get to today, we'll forward on to you. And when we publish the links for the presentation, we can also do a quick summary of those questions.
Happy to help.
All right, great. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope this information was very useful to you. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.